The topic for today isn't exactly the topic of the book. I'll tell you a little bit about the book just to set the stage. Hezbollah is lots of things. And I state at the very beginning of the book, this book is not intended to replace but complement the literature, the vast literature that's already out there on Hezbollah. And there's one man here who's got a very good book, also published by Hearst, that you should definitely read. I have, and I learned a lot. But the problem with the literature that's been out there is that it is almost solely focused on Hezbollah's activities in Lebanon, which are critical. Hezbollah is a Lebanese entity. Its identity is Lebanese. It is a political party. It is a social welfare movement. It is a standing militia. And anybody who tells you at either end of the two spectrums, Hezbollah is only that and is not involved in militancy, political violence, or terrorism around the world. It isn't involved in criminal activities in Europe or North America. It isn't involved in arms procurement or other things. Is just patently wrong. And anybody who tells you that they're only a terrorist group or a proxy for Iran is no less wrong. What you have, therefore, have had for years in the open literature is a gap, where if you looked at the literature, you could learn a lot about Hezbollah in Lebanon, accurate stuff, good stuff, and you still didn't have a full holistic picture of the organization. And that's what I tried to fill here. And I state this openly in the book. This is not to say that all those other things in Lebanon are not true or unimportant. To the contrary, they're very much true. They're very important, but they're not enough to have a holistic view of Hezbollah. And as I did a literature review after a conference in Washington where a bunch of people from Lebanon stood up and said, Hezbollah has never done an act of militancy abroad ever, and I know that you Americans and Israelis think there's a boogeyman, some terrorist out there named Imad Mughniya, but we don't think he exists. Well, he did exist. He was assassinated in February 2008, and the man who did in fact lead Hezbollah's terrorist wing, and who therefore, whose existence was denied in death, was then afterwards embraced in life. That someone could stand up at a conference like this and said that led me to believe, well, what's out there? We did this literature review, and we realized there's almost nothing out there on Hezbollah's activities abroad. For people like me, who've had the opportunity and privilege to work on subjects like these in and out of government, there's a need in the open source quite clearly to have a discussion about these things. And so I just started doing interviews around the world. And what we end up having is this book, which has Israeli information in it, to be sure, and American and British information in it, to be sure, but also Kuwaiti and Jordanian and Egyptian and Turkish and Chilean and Singaporean and Filipino and Romanian and a whole lot more. Turns out there are a lot of different countries who've had investigations related to Hezbollah, and understanding these in a serious way without blowing them out of proportion, without screaming fire in the cinema, was what we're out to do. The majority of the book is historical. The first chapter and the last chapter get to issues today, and I think we're going to be talking more about the issues today as we move forward. So I'll just spend the last couple of minutes talking about today. In February 2008, when Mughniya, who did live, was then killed, Hassan Nasrallah at his funeral, by video teleconference for fear he'd be next, said, Israel, you want open war, let it be open war. There's actually some interesting evidence now that neither Iran nor Hezbollah fully believed that the Israelis were behind the Mughniya assassination at the time that he made this threat, though they're clearly quite convinced that the Israelis were behind it now. Nonetheless, you didn't have to wait very long before the first Hezbollah operations targeting senior Israeli officials, some current, some former, took place. The first in Baku, Azerbaijan, targeting the Israeli ambassador there. And then other operations in Africa, a couple in southern Europe, Turkey, Cyprus. That plotline continues today, including 2 plots within Israel proper. And for that, as Nasrallah once told a Kuwaiti journalist, to avenge Mughniya's death, that has to be someone of stature. Meanwhile, since 2010, early 2010, Hezbollah has also begun targeting Israeli tourists around the world, having nothing to do with Lebanon, nothing to do with Mughniya at all, and doing it because Iran has asked them to put pressure on Israel to exact revenge, exact a cost on Israel for the actions Iran perceives Israel as doing to undermine Iran's nuclear program, and to perhaps trying to deter them from doing further such actions in the future. Nasrallah actually gave an interview to a Kuwaiti newspaper. It was at a very critical time, just before the Burgas, Bulgaria bombings, and just after Hussam Yaqub, a dual Lebanese-Swedish citizen, the second Lebanese dual Swedish citizen to be arrested abroad in 6 months. Hussein Atris had been arrested 6 months earlier in Thailand. Since both of them, one in Cyprus and one in Thailand, have been convicted and are serving jail terms, there are other cases ongoing around the world, including Nigeria and others. after Hussam Yaqub was arrested, but before it was made public that he was arrested. So we in the open source world didn't know about this. And a week and a half before Burgas, Bulgaria, Nasrallah gave an interview to a Kuwaiti journalist who was either very, very brave or very, very stupid. He says to Nasrallah, so Nasrallah, I guess you just don't really care about Mughniya, do you? Because you haven't avenged his death. And Nasrallah says very patiently, no, we care very much, and all in good time. And so he continues and says, well, then I guess you're just not very good, because you haven't succeeded in avenging his death. And Nasrallah very patiently says, no, we're quite good, thank you, but it also has to be the will of God. And when those two intersect, then it will happen, which Nasrallah wouldn't like me saying so, but is almost Talmudic in its logic. And then he volunteers without a question, by the way, if we wanted to hit an Israeli tourist here or there sometime, we can do that. That's not from Mughniya. I saw it at the time, others saw it at the time, and assumed it was bravado, but it wasn't. Already, Hussam Yaqub had been arrested in Cyprus for just this. And this was messaging that there are other things going on. Today, we have an overlay of a completely different phenomenon in Syria. Also, not only, but very much at the behest of Iran, which has presented the greatest challenge, I think, that Hezbollah has ever faced. Because, again, Hezbollah is not only, as the US intelligence community puts it, in a strategic relationship with Iran as the primary partner. They are also deeply Lebanese. They do care about Lebanon and their stature and their place in Lebanon. And what's going on in Syria, far more than attacking Israelis abroad or the Special Tribunal for Lebanon in The Hague or exposures of narcotics activities through the actions targeting the Lebanese Canadian Bank, what's happening in Lebanon is challenging their identity as a resistance organization resisting Israel, because the Israelis, you know, are not in Syria. And it's challenging their contention that they are Lebanese and Lebanese first, because what they are doing in Lebanon is bringing what was a rebellion and became a civil war and was turned into a sectarian bloodfest that is not respecting international borders across the border into Lebanon and is by no definition in Lebanon's interest. If you're Lebanese, whatever confession, whatever religion, your greatest fear is renewed civil war. And Hezbollah's breaking with the government's policy of disassociation is not in any stretch of the imagination in Lebanon's interest. I'll just conclude with this. Not everything Hezbollah does is because Iran tells it to. Hezbollah has its own interests and has done some attacks abroad out of its own interests. Hezbollah is also not al-Qaeda in the least and should never be compared to it, not just because one is Shia, one is Sunni. Al-Qaeda is nihilistic, and if they wanted to get you today and they could tomorrow, they would. Hezbollah is deeply rational. Violence is a legitimate tool, no less, no more than politics or others. But they're not looking to do violence per se. If achieving their goals through violence, preferably with reasonable deniability, but through violence is the best way to achieve a goal, they won't shy from doing it. But it's not like they're looking to engage in violence all the time. It's a very different type of entity. You can't put all acts of terrorism in the same bucket. But there is a constant of Hezbollah's relationship with Iran. The relationship is constant, even as it has shifted over time, as all relationships do. Today, Hezbollah's relationship with Iran is clearly, I think, as you see in Syria, paramount, even above and beyond its concern over its stature in Lebanon. And my conclusion is this. The evidence for this being a relationship and a theme that goes ongoing goes back 30 years actually last week, to the bombing of the Marine barracks, US Marine barracks, and the French military of the multinational force in Beirut. It wasn't the first time Hezbollah targeted Western interests in Lebanon. They'd already blown up the US embassy. It wasn't the last time, and a few months later, they blew up the US embassy annex. And shortly after that, they moved from attacking Western interests in Lebanon to attacking Western interests in Kuwait, to attacking Western interests and Israeli interests both in Europe, South America, and more. Those first forays were all at Iran's behest. Among the many pieces of declassified intelligence in the book is this, and with this I really will end. We know for a fact, 3.5 weeks before the embassy bombings, before the Marine barracks bombings, 30 years ago last week, 3.5 weeks earlier, US intelligence intercepted a telephone call between Iran's Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Tehran and Iran's ambassador in Damascus. And the Iranian ambassador was told to reach out to Mr. Musawi, who at the time was the head of Islamic Amal, the largest of the Shia militias that were then at that time being brought under what was originally an umbrella of Hezbollah, the Party of God, and fairly quickly became the hierarchical structured organization we know today. He later played quite a role of his own in Hezbollah, and to task Musawi with, quote, carrying out a spectacular action against the US Marines. Hezbollah had no Lebanese or personal interest in Kuwait and targeting Western interests in Kuwait or the Kuwaiti emir himself. They almost blew him up, but they targeted the wrong car in the convoy. It was because Kuwait was supporting Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. 15 bombings in 85 and 86 in Paris, again, nothing to do with Lebanon, or for that matter, even Israel. It was because France was supporting Iraq with weapons during the Iran-Iraq War. That relationship matters. It's not the only one that matters. Hezbollah cares about Lebanon, and it is Lebanese, and that's what makes it so difficult to understand and needs the kind of analysis that we are trying to provide for you today in Michael's book and my own book, because it is a complicated organization. The world is not like Homeland, for those of you who watch it. The real world is complicated and shades of gray. Hezbollah has overt and covert activities. The overt activities, there's lots of literature. My hope is, as I conclude in the book, that with this we will begin to have a discussion about its covert and overt activities both, which affect one another.
You know, looking back to 2006, Hezbollah famously won over the Arab street by withstanding the might of the Israeli army, the West, and anti-Iranian Arab regimes in the Middle East that all wanted to see Hezbollah crushed. Now, when I visited South Lebanon shortly after that conflict, I was amazed to see posters being sold on billboards of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and Gamal Abdel Nasser on the same page. Hezbollah had become the most influential party in Lebanon, and rising from the ashes of Lebanon's civil war to the dizzy heights of pan-Arab populism was really no mean feat, and we shouldn't forget that for a Shia Islamist party, albeit with Syrian sponsorship and consistent spiritual, financial, military, and political backing from Iran. Now, 7 summers later, after this surprising 2006 victory / survival, Hezbollah seems to have completely lost the ephemeral Arab street. It is more concerned with its own revolts, having forgotten the Arab-Israeli conflict for a moment. It has lost the influence of the Syrian master that nurtured it after the civil war and brought it from militia to kingmaker in Lebanese domestic politics. And it appears to have been sidetracked or somewhat lost its raison d'etre in freeing Arab lands from Israeli control. It is presently fighting uncomfortably on 2 fronts in Lebanon. Internally, it is providing much needed support for the Lebanese army against what Hassan Nasrallah describes as Takfiri extremists, radicals. And externally, it is fighting against the Free Syrian Army and Sunni Islamist groups in Syria in order to maintain key strategic routes to Beirut and Lebanon, and more than that in the outskirts of Damascus as well, it would seem. But Lebanon must be particularly concerned about its southern border. A couple of interesting things I noticed in August was that when Israel was hit by a couple of rockets, it then retaliated by bombing the Popular Front, the pro-Syrian Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command in Lebanon, and not Hezbollah. Hezbollah did not receive the blame. Subsequently, Hezbollah's stronghold in southern Beirut is car-bombed, and 27 people are killed. And equally notably, Hassan Nasrallah does not blame the Israelis, but he blames the Takfiris. So I'm saying it probably suits Israel for Hezbollah to be tied up, doing what the Lebanese and Syrian armies are incapable of doing on their own, and that is dealing with Sunni Islamist factions that threaten Hezbollah's dominance in Lebanon and its allies in Syria. I suppose the Israelis might say they're content to see them cancelling each other out. Moreover, opening a third Hezbollah front in southern Lebanon would weaken the Assad regime at a time that it is engaging in an internationally led chemical weapons decommissioning process, and it would certainly risk pushing Lebanon over the brink into civil war. of course the Israelis would be blamed. Keeping Lebanon's southern border quiet might well have been part of the recent US-Russian deal over Syria, but that is my own speculation. However, the whole conflict represents considerable challenges and problems, deep problems for Hezbollah and its future in Lebanon. There are divisions within the party over its engagement in Syria. They have suffered considerable losses. It's impossible to tell exactly how many, but there have been many funerals and some of high-ranking people. And grassroots support for its engagement in Syria is lukewarm at best. Its leadership will, of course, argue that it is defending Lebanon's borders. But in doing so, it has broken Lebanon's old national pact and by directly involving the state in an inter-Arab conflict in Syria's civil war. And the more it becomes involved, and there surely will be more significant battles in Syria within which Hezbollah is the key actor, the more it becomes embroiled, the more obvious it is that Hezbollah is acting in Iran's interests and putting Iranian foreign policy goals ahead of Lebanon's security and sovereignty. This clearly risks civil war in Lebanon, a war that Hezbollah would ultimately be blamed for by Lebanon's non-Shia communities. Yet it has very little choice, as Iran, with the collapse of or weakening of the Assad regime, it's the only constant supporter that Hezbollah has in the region or internationally. Now, having said all that, the détente between the US and Russia over Syria seems to me to be a big plus for Hezbollah, as is the decommissioning process, which will somewhat reduce, but not entirely, Israeli fears that these weapons will fall into the hands of Islamist radicals. So much so that Nasrallah has recently taken to chastising the Saudis for their negative reaction to the proposed Geneva II process in November this year, and their unwillingness to countenance any form of political solution to the Syrian crisis, a political solution which Hezbollah desperately wants and desperately needs. So in the short term, thinking about what the future holds for Hezbollah, and in conclusion, its main priority will be, I think, to avoid opening up a third front with Israel. While it will continue to support the Lebanese army in regulating or keeping a lid on the domestic factions that are challenging it, and opportunists who may try to take to provoke an Israeli response against Hezbollah at a moment of great tension. It will continue to support the Syrian regime in containing the Free Syrian Army and clearing out the Islamist factions from Lebanon's border areas, whilst probably continuing to blame these internal and external threats on Saudi-sponsored Salafists rather than the Israelis. In the longer term, and it is difficult to predict, fearing a military response from Israel, Iran would be very reluctant to openly put troops on the ground in Syria if a political solution in Geneva fails and the tables begin to turn. Thus, in the absence of a positive outcome to Geneva II, I think Hezbollah will certainly become deeper and deeper and more embroiled in the Syrian civil war. And finally, I think it's going to be very difficult for Hezbollah to rebuild its Lebanese credentials on the Arab street and in Lebanon, as the Sunni-Shia split in Lebanon has intensified and it is very close to the bone. But a political solution would help Nasrallah. And of course, Hezbollah has reinvented itself a number of times in the past, yet it has not faced internal and external existential threats of this magnitude since 2006, and that is without even factoring Israel into the equation.
My background and my comments derive, as Ian perhaps said at the outset, from my experience as a UN official in dealing with Hezbollah over several years. This started in 2006 with after the war between Israel and Hezbollah and the adoption of Resolution 1701. I was then director for the Middle East and Asia in the Department of Political Affairs in New York. And one of the files that Kofi Annan gave me to handle was the issue which had sparked the war, which was the casus belli, namely the attack on an Israeli patrol and the abduction of two Israeli soldiers. My involvement grew from 2008 to 2011, when I was the Secretary General's personal representative and also the senior political official of the UN in Lebanon, which was a very fascinating experience. I dealt with Hezbollah, both with the public wing of the organization and also the, if you like, the darker side, the security side. I should say at the outset, this was with the full knowledge of the State of Israel, because how else would you resolve the issue of the fate of those soldiers? And indeed, one of the sort of privileges, as it were, of my post was that I could cross the blue line between Lebanon and Israel. You could have lunch in Beirut and dinner in Tel Aviv. And as one Israeli general said to me, and I know where the food was better. And he, Matthew's book looks obviously at the external activities of Hezbollah, the terrorism, the violence that it has deployed. But as I think he himself has acknowledged, one has to understand the roots of Hezbollah, its politics. Michael has addressed some of that. This is the political voice of the Shia community, or the vast majority of Shia in Lebanon. The only other party really is Amal, the party of the speaker, Nabi Berri, now in his late 70s. And I think a party after his passing away, which will decline, and Hezbollah will become stronger politically rather than less. Its heartland, we know, it's the Dahia suburb, South Beirut, southern Lebanon, particularly south of the Litani River, and the Bekaa Valley. In these areas, it is very strong. Correspondingly, the Lebanese state is virtually absent. We had hoped, those of us involved in the 1701 resolution in 2006, that the resolution in itself would go some way to building, or trying to build anew, as it were, the Lebanese state. For the first time in decades, I think it's 30 years, the Lebanese army was deployed in the south. Now, we envisaged that other parts of the state apparatus would also move south, as it were. But that did not happen. Hospitals, orphanages, centers for the disabled, all these things are run by Hezbollah. They're not run by the Lebanese state. And indeed, I served in Lebanon with 3 Lebanese prime ministers, as it were. The first was Fouad Siniora, then there was Saad Hariri, and most recently Najib Mikati. I could not get those first 2 prime ministers ever to visit southern Lebanon. They never did. And, we're not talking about Australia here. This is a tiny country. I mean, you can go for coffee in mid-morning down in Nakura and come back for a late lunch in Beirut. They would not go. Now, with Najib Mikati, I did manage to get him to go, but that was interesting. He came to Nakura, which is the headquarters of UNIFIL, right on close to the Blue Line. But he did, and met with UN soldiers, their commanders there, but did not meet with local personalities. All of them would say, we can meet with Hezbollah, but it will only be in Beirut. And the state, which is weak nationally, but especially in the south, has left this vacuum which Hezbollah has very, very ably filled. Another point I'd like to make is the Christian population in Lebanon. There's a block of Christian in Lebanon, supporters of the FPM, the Free Patriotic Movement, of General Michel Aoun, which is in political alliance with Hezbollah. And in fact, many of their seats in parliament are because of Hezbollah support. Now, often with some of these people, with Aoun himself, I would sort of challenge him on this, why are you linked up with Hezbollah? And the sort of terrorism and the rest of it. He said, look, and in a way it's an echo of what's happening in Syria. He said it's our fear of where the Christians will be in the Middle East. And he pointedly would often refer to Iraq after the US-UK invasion of 2003, and how I think at least about 50% of Iraqi Christians, whose community, of course, goes back centuries, have left the country. And he said, we will not let that fate happen here. And in that regard, our alliance with Hezbollah is very critical. I think a few words about the relationship between, if one can call it that, between Israel and Hezbollah. One of the remarkable things is that 1701 has held, and it's held well. It's now well over 7 years since that war. There's a crude form of deterrence which applies, and Hezbollah officials talk about this privately. And in one remarkable speech, I think in 2010, Nasrallah addressed it. And he said, we all know the dangers of another war. And if that happens, Israelis will attack Hariri Airport in Beirut. We will attack Ben Gurion Airport then. And then the Israelis will attack our 2 power stations, which are very old, from the 1950s, I think. And then we will attack theirs. And then he sort of, the sense of mischief and humor even in some of his speeches. And he said, dear viewers, listeners, Israel has far greater infrastructure than we have. And it'll be a long time before we would run out of targets. Behind this, we're talking about a cessation of hostilities, as I say, which is held. What we could not achieve was a formal ceasefire. But Olmert, the former prime minister, once said to me, he said, Ambassador, for the first time in 30 years, we have quiet on our northern border. There have been incidents, some of which Hezbollah may have known of, but none of those incidents, as far as I recall, have resulted in Israeli fatalities, some injuries. And there's at least one case I know where Hezbollah killed a Palestinian who was going to be involved in an incident. So they police that sort of fire, that cessation of hostilities. But the shame is, of course, we've not been able to build from that onto a formal ceasefire or to expand the capacity of the Lebanese state. And without that, Hezbollah will exist, I'm afraid, for a very long time, and is likely to continue to engage in the sort of activities very well documented by Matthew's book.